Imagine, just for a moment, that the most forceful economic assault in modern history, launched by the President of the United States with the full confidence of the world's largest economy, didn't just fail to bring its target to its knees. Imagine that instead it hardened that target, accelerated its ambitions, unshackled it from decades of economic dependency and flung it, not into recession, but into a moment of stunning economic strength. And now imagine this. While American politicians declared victory and Wall Street cheered, the real results, the lasting tectonic results, were unfolding thousands of miles away in boardrooms and bunkers and bureaucracies across China, where a slow-burning plan decades in the making finally snapped into action. This isn't fiction. It's exactly what happened. The year was 2025. America, once again under the leadership of Donald J. Trump, had returned to a state of economic brinkmanship. This time there would be no half measures, no hesitation, no backing down. Trump, re-elected on a wave of nationalist rhetoric and promises of economic dominance, had come back with one goal above all: to finish the job he believed had been prematurely interrupted during his first term. That job was to economically contain, if not crush, China. The premise was simple, the confidence absolute. Trump and his team believed China was more vulnerable than ever, over-leveraged, export-dependent, still licking its wounds from earlier trade wars, and above all, reliant on access to American markets, technologies, and dollars. So they deployed every weapon in the economic arsenal. Tariffs weren't just raised, they were detonated. 25%, 50%, even 100% on some categories. Overnight, entire sectors of the Chinese economy were locked out of the American market. But that was only the beginning. The US launched financial sanctions on Chinese banks, export controls on semiconductors, bans on critical software and IP, and sweeping restrictions on investment in anything deemed strategic. It wasn't just economic pressure. It was economic war. The White House believed it had a chokehold. Policymakers went on air to declare that this time, China wouldn't recover. That the numbers would start plunging. That unemployment in Shenzhen and Guangzhou would rise. That Xi Jinping would be forced back to the table, humbled, negotiating not from strength but survival. That Chinese GDP growth would slip below 3%. That US companies would flee en masse and rebuild supply chains in India, Mexico, Vietnam. But what they didn't understand, what they never saw coming, was that China had been waiting for this. Not passively, not fearfully, but meticulously, methodically, with the patience of a civilization that thinks in centuries, not quarters. For 5 years, Chinese strategists, economists, and party officials had been gaming out this exact scenario. They had watched the trade war of Trump's first term like a rehearsal. They studied every US move, every tariff, every loophole, every mistake. And then they built a response so vast, so multi-layered, so quietly effective, that when the second wave came, they didn't flinch. In the early months of 2025, as US tariffs exploded across the economic landscape, China responded not with anger, but with silence. Not with retaliation, but with speed. Factories across eastern and southern China surged into overdrive. Cargo ships left port at a furious pace. Supply chains lit up. At first, Western observers misread the signs. They assumed China was panicking, that the rush was desperation. But it wasn't. It was a calculated maneuver known inside Chinese state circles as Qian Chong, the forward surge, or more technically, front-loading. Beijing had ordered a massive acceleration of exports before the full weight of US tariffs could crash down. American ports were flooded with Chinese goods. Warehouses from Long Beach to Savannah began to fill. Retailers and distributors, fearing future shortages and higher prices, began hoarding. And in doing so, they unwittingly delivered Beijing something priceless: a cash surge. Billions of dollars in upfront payments for goods that hadn't even reached store shelves, all flowing into China's economy at the very moment Washington thought it would be drying up. But the surge was only the first layer. Behind the scenes, Chinese export strategy was undergoing a historic reconfiguration. For years, Beijing had been criticized for pouring trillions into the Belt and Road Initiative, an expansive web of infrastructure stretching from Southeast Asia to Africa to Eastern Europe. Critics called it reckless, corrupt, a debt trap. But in 2025, it became something else entirely, an escape route. China began rerouting exports away from America. Markets in Vietnam, Indonesia, Kenya, Turkey, and Brazil saw Chinese trade volumes skyrocket. Ports built with Chinese money now moved Chinese goods with Chinese ships bound for Chinese-owned distribution networks. Beijing wasn't just avoiding tariffs. It was decoupling from dependence itself. And the decoupling didn't stop with exports. The true genius of Beijing's counterstrike was that it didn't just react. It evolved. It turned crisis into opportunity. The chip bans? They lit a fire under China's tech sector. Beijing launched the most aggressive industrial investment campaign in its history. funneling billions into homegrown chip firms, memory manufacturers, and advanced fabrication plants. SMCE, a once secondary Chinese chipmaker, became a national champion overnight. New fabs rose from the ground in Hebei, Anhui, and Sichuan. And while Western observers laughed that China couldn't yet build 3nm chips, they missed the point. China didn't need the best chips. It needed its own. Meanwhile, Chinese consumption, the so-called weak link in its growth model, was quietly rising. The party unleashed a domestic stimulus wave. Infrastructure booms, consumer rebates, green energy subsidies, real estate stabilization funds. The People's Bank of China began easing. Banks extended credit. E-commerce rebounded. Middle-class consumption began to rise, not in Shanghai or Beijing, but in the inland cities the West never sees. Changsha, Zhengzhou, Guiyang. Places with millions of new consumers who didn't care about U.S. tariffs. They were buying Chinese. By June, American economists were nervous. The indicators weren't lining up with predictions. Factory activity in China remained strong. Export volumes were down in the U.S., but up everywhere else. And consumer spending in China? Surprisingly healthy. Then came the number that shattered everything. July 15, 2025, 10:55 a.m. Beijing time. China's National Bureau of Statistics released its Q2 GDP figures. 5.2% growth. Not a crash. Not a recession. Not even stagnation. Growth. In the middle of an all-out economic war with the United States. Western markets convulsed. Analysts were stunned. Politicians were silent. And in boardrooms across the world, a new question took hold. What if we were wrong? What if China wasn't the vulnerable one? What if America, in trying to assert dominance, had revealed its own economic fragility? Because while China was turning crisis into transformation, America was feeling the pain. Tariff-driven inflation pushed prices higher across key categories. Electronics, appliances, construction materials. Supply chains proved harder to rebuild than promised. Manufacturing didn't come home, it stalled. And American companies, locked out of a reorganizing Chinese market, found themselves less competitive abroad. The world saw it, even if Washington didn't. In New Delhi, in Riyadh, in Jakarta, governments began to hedge. They didn't turn away from the U.S., but they no longer believed it was invincible. In embassies and think tanks and private meetings, one phrase began to circulate. China absorbed the hit and got stronger. Trump had tried to force submission. But China, instead of bowing, broke free. Not with retaliation, but with reinvention. The tariffs didn't cripple China, they accelerated its escape. They forced the birth of an economic model no longer anchored to the United States. And that's the real twist, because the goal wasn't just to punish China. It was to reassert American primacy. But in attempting to weaken its rival, the U.S. exposed its own vulnerabilities and launched the very transformation that may make China more resilient for decades to come. History won't remember this as a bold victory. It may remember it as the moment China stopped being America's factory and became its peer. The expectation had been contraction, retreat, a slowing of the gears within China's economic machine as the weight of U.S. tariffs and weakening global trade bore down. But instead, something entirely different unfolded. Chinese consumer spending, far from collapsing, surged with surprising vitality. What many outside observers failed to anticipate was that while foreign demand for Chinese exports softened, domestic consumption stepped in to fill the void. The government's swift deployment of stimulus measures paired with a powerful surge in national pride, encouraging citizens to buy Chinese rather than imported alternatives, ignited a wave of spending that cascaded through the economy with astonishing force. Supermarkets, tech stores, and domestic travel hubs brimmed with activity. The mood was not of desperation but defiance. Because while China was turning crisis into transformation, America was feeling the pain. Tariff-driven inflation pushed prices higher across key categories. Electronics, appliances, construction materials. Supply chains proved harder to rebuild than promised. Manufacturing didn't come home, it stalled. And American companies, locked out of a reorganizing Chinese market, found themselves less competitive abroad. The world saw it, even if Washington didn't. In New Delhi, in Riyadh, in Jakarta, governments began to hedge. They didn't turn away from the U.S., but they no longer believed it was invincible. In embassies and think tanks and private meetings, one phrase began to circulate. China absorbed the hit and got stronger. Trump had tried to force submission, but China, instead of bowing, broke free. Not with retaliation, but with reinvention. The tariffs didn't cripple China, they accelerated its escape. They forced the birth of an economic model no longer anchored to the United States. And that's the real twist, because the goal wasn't just to punish China, it was to reassert American primacy. But in attempting to weaken its rival, the U.S. exposed its own vulnerabilities and launched the very transformation that may make China more resilient for decades to come. History won't remember this as a bold victory. It may remember it as the moment China stopped being America's factory and became its peer. The expectation had been contraction, retreat, a slowing of the gears within China's economic machine as the weight of U.S. tariffs and weakening global trade bore down. But instead, something entirely different unfolded. Chinese consumer spending, far from collapsing, surged with surprising vitality. What many outside observers failed to anticipate was that while foreign demand for Chinese exports softened, domestic consumption stepped in to fill the void. The government's swift deployment of stimulus measures paired with a powerful surge in national pride, encouraging citizens to buy Chinese rather than imported alternatives, ignited a wave of spending that cascaded through the economy with astonishing force. Supermarkets, tech stores, and domestic travel hubs brimmed with activity. The mood was not of desperation but defiance. Consequences of decoupling. Analysts issued bleak revisions. Investors readjusted portfolios. Trump appeared before the press with characteristic bravado, calling China's numbers fiction and threatening new rounds of tariffs. But behind the curtain, a different mood prevailed. Quiet recognition that the administration had miscalculated not only the depth of China's economic stamina, but the fragility of America's own position. That realization began to ripple through the international system. Countries that had previously hedged began reorienting. ASEAN states, long adept at balancing great powers, saw in China a pillar of economic stability. Their integration with Chinese-led financial systems and supply chains deepened. In Tokyo, Seoul, Singapore, and Jakarta, corporate boardrooms re-examined strategies, no longer certain that following Washington's lead would ensure long-term security. Even America's closest allies began voicing private concerns. German manufacturers faced impossible dilemmas. Their industries relied on Chinese components, but their politics were being pulled westward. Japanese firms watched as their tightly knit regional networks unraveled under the pressure of a trade war they didn't start and couldn't influence. Inside China, the government's actions revealed a longer horizon. The crisis had not merely been endured, it had been weaponized into momentum. The export front-loading of the early trade war period gave Beijing breathing room to initiate broader structural reforms. Stimulus funds flowed not just into immediate consumption, but into long-term investments. New high-speed rail lines, smart manufacturing zones, advanced robotics labs, AI research hubs, and semiconductor fabrication plants. It was not recovery for recovery's sake. It was transformation. It was strategic fortification. And as that transformation accelerated, the domestic mood remained remarkably calm. Citizens, like 30-year-old Dr. Mallory Zhang in Shenzhen, described making modest adjustments to their spending habits, but showed little evidence of panic. The nation, in its own way, had internalized a shared belief in weathering the storm together. The consequences, 6 months on, had transcended economics. The trade war had catalyzed a global reshuffling. Rather than isolating China, it had helped birth a more fragmented, multipolar economic landscape. America's attempt to assert dominance had accelerated the rise of new economic blocs. Networks of trade, investment, and innovation no longer centered on Washington. China stood at the heart of one such bloc, drawing in much of Asia, extending its reach into Africa, and developing deeper, if sometimes cautious, partnerships in Europe. The Belt and Road Initiative, once written off as a debt-laden geopolitical vanity project, gained new urgency and relevance. Countries previously wary of China's intentions now saw those ports, railways, and power grids as buffers, alternatives to the volatility and unilateralism of American economic statecraft. What had been symbols of overreach were now lifelines of integration. Ironically, the very attempts to sever China from Western technological ecosystems triggered a renaissance in Chinese innovation. Forced off the established path, Chinese firms began building their own. Semiconductor companies accelerated R&D, developing chips that, while initially inferior, improved rapidly and began edging toward global competitiveness. Software firms, locked out of U.S. markets, cultivated new products tailored for domestic and emerging markets. What began as a defensive maneuver had, in months, become a foundation for offensive capacity. Even the global monetary order began to shift. As the dollar's status became entangled with American politics and weaponized sanctions, countries started reconsidering their financial exposures. The yuan, once dismissed as too opaque or too tightly controlled, began to appear as a viable alternative. If not a replacement, then at least a hedge. Cross-border trade denominated in yuan grew, and financial partnerships once dominated by U.S. institutions began exploring Chinese-led alternatives. Meanwhile, the American consumer bore the brunt. The promised economic revival had not materialized. The tariffs remained. So did the higher prices. The cost of living continued its upward march, eroding confidence and exposing the hollowness of promises made. Manufacturing had not returned in force because it could not. Global supply chains are not plug-and-play. The skills, machinery, and capital needed to produce high-tech goods domestically were not simply dormant, they were missing altogether. Businesses that stayed in China continued to face political backlash. Those that tried to relocate found new suppliers more expensive, less efficient, and logistically precarious. The broader implications were clear. The trade war had revealed a fundamental truth: that power in the 21st century is not only measured in GDP, armies, or tariffs, but in resilience, adaptability, and the ability to shape systems. China had demonstrated all three. What began as a confrontation meant to contain it had, instead, expanded its influence. While America fought to preserve its primacy through coercion, China quietly built networks of interdependence that made it indispensable to more of the world. And as the dust settled, it became impossible to ignore the new reality. The old order was no longer dominant. A new one had not yet fully emerged, but the contours were taking shape, and in this emerging landscape, China was not on the defensive. It was helping redraw the map,